Today we're going to be taking a look at your mini lesson for the Spanish-American War, and specifically we're going to be looking at the causes and effects of that war in Cuba. So let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so we're going to look at how the causes of wars like the Spanish-American War are sometimes more complex than what appears on the surface. And no, that was not a main joke, even though that ship, well, was for a time on the surface. And then we're also going to look at some of the legacies of this particular war. Okay, to give us a little bit of context here, okay, so from 1850 all the way up to 1898, okay, Cuba had been owned by Spain and had attempted several times to rebel against them. Now, Cuba at this time, because again, the United States is kind of, after the Civil War, looking to expand upon things, both nationally and now overseas. They're starting to trade with the U.S., and as well Cuba still traded with Spain, obviously. Now, what was life like in Cuba during this time? It varies. Eventually, though, as we start to get towards the end of the 19th century, is that we find that Spain basically started treating their Cuban population quite harshly. And so essentially, to kind of boil things down, because this is not really the focus of our lesson here, is that they started hurting Cubans in what were called reconcentrado centers, which are essentially detention towns. Concentration camp isn't really exactly the best way to put it, even though I know that's kind of what that looks like. They're basically places where they would force an entire population of a town to stay in a location, so that way at night they could not get out and then rebel against Spanish troops that were there. However, these conditions were pretty unhealthy. It also causes a lot of famine, because simply people couldn't get out to farm, and so you can actually see pictures of kids down here who are obviously pretty malnourished. Now, in the U.S., what's going on with Cuba is that before the Civil War, you started to hear some ideas being tossed around by Southerners that the United States should expand and take over Cuba. Now, this was proposed both in a slavery sense before the Civil War, and then afterwards, kind of in a manifest destiny way of thinking. And what kind of we see there is a whole bunch of things called filibustering. Okay, now filibustering is not also just it's not just the thing where you stand in front of the Senate and you prevent the Senate from voting. A filibuster is also a name given to when you are a private citizen, you raise up an army, and you go invade another country as a private citizen. Okay, and there were several Americans who actually did attempt to do this before the Cuban-American War. So there's also this precedent that's also been happening before even the conflict in the war breaks out. Okay, so what are the causes of the Spanish-American War? A couple of things. I would tell you to remember that the acronym LIMS is probably the best way to go. So it's several things. L, liberation. Okay, so they're certainly in the media, and then also in the government, kind of like governmental, kind of a high official level. We see a lot of rhetoric about that the U.S. thinks that they should liberate Cubans from being oppressed by the Spanish. And then that kind of ties into I, which is ideals, and that through conquering, the U.S. can teach Cubans progressive ideas, such as democracy, Protestant Christianity, etc., etc. Okay, so a little bit of healthy manifest destiny, and also kind of Victorian values like "we will improve you," kind of thinking. Okay, and again, there's M, manifest destiny. So that's our next one: expansion of U.S. influence in the Caribbean and overseas. And we're gonna start to talk about imperialism. Okay, the beginning of empire. B, business interests. Okay, the U.S. did have a lot of business and trade interests that they wanted to protect in Cuba, and so that also kind of had something to do with it. And then last but not least is S, scandal, and that is the yellow, or the cover of yellow journalism on the Maine. Okay, now if you haven't heard about the Maine, or you don't know what yellow journalism is, it's pretty straightforward. We'll take a look at it here. Okay, but what I'd like you to do, look at what causes it. Okay, could it be more than one? It's very possible. Something that, again, is an important skill with history is that we not just pick like a singular cause, but then we also understand that there can be multiple motivations for things all at the same time, and that all can be valid. Some can be a little bit more valid than others. It's all kind of important thinking. Okay, so the trigger. Now, let's actually talk about the Maine. Okay, it was called the The slogan afterward was called "Remember the Maine," and so what the Maine was a U.S. battleship that was sent to Cuba. Okay, ostensibly it was said to keep an eye on really the Spanish and what had been going on there in the country. And what happened was that all of a sudden one night the ship blew up. Okay. Now, basically, what it was blamed on at the time was that the ship had been torpedoed by the Spanish. Okay. Now, again, a torpedo at that time is in some cases like a torpedo that we think of today, but more often it was thought of a mine. And so they had thought that the Spanish had essentially blown up a U.S. ship. It hit the powder magazines, and it was a gigantic explosion, killed a ton of American sailors. And what we see after that was a whole bunch of what we call yellow journalism, which is essentially like scandalous, semi kind of like somewhat true, somewhat untrue coverage, but again, focusing on the sensationalism of the attack that people blamed for causing the war. Now, the president at the time, that's William McKinley, did declare war over the Maine incident after quite a few months of pushing. Okay, from an American populace and then also other people in the government. Okay, now later historians and some forensic experts did some work, and they actually found that, that it was an accidental fire in the coal stores of the ship that ignited the gunpowder magazine. Okay, so it wasn't even the Spanish. Even remotely. So again, this is sometimes an interesting thing. How sometimes these wars happen just based off of accidents. The war was very, very short versus Spain. Okay, I'll get into a little bit of content here. The U.S. invades Cuba. They destroy the Spanish fleet there. Okay, we will talk about what happens to them in the Philippines next class. Okay, because that also is a site of the Spanish-American War. Okay. There is a very, very famous battle, and I only bring this up because it involves a certain person at San Juan Hill by the Rough Riders. And the Rough Riders was basically this group of essentially semi-mercenaries, semi-military, individuals that were gathered together by a certain Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, and they, the person who will become president, and they had run up a hill, not ridden, so kind of Rough Riders, a bit of a misnomer, and it was also a whole bunch of black cavalry, which really don't get mentioned. Okay, these guys had actually, in some cases, forgot their horses, so that was kind of a mistake. Okay, but anyways, it's led by TR. Okay, and this battle that's kind of well known, it's called San Juan Hill. TR really gets his start here, being known as both a national figure and then kind of goes on to use that to launch his political career afterwards. Okay, so what happens basically is that the U.S. invades Cuba, destroys the Spanish fleet, and takes over Cuba. A couple fun things here. We will talk about this next class, or a couple classes from now, when we talk about TR. He quit his job as an assistant secretary of the Navy in order to go fight. And the TR later actually lobbied Congress from this battle to give him the Medal of Honor, which is normally not how you apply for the Medal of Honor. It's either given to you for something that you did that was pretty darn awesome, or it's given to you for something that you did that was pretty darn awesome and you died. So the Medal of Honor is incredibly hard to get, but he actually lobbies Congress for it. And, of course, he gets it thanks to President Clinton in 2001. Okay, so kind of an interesting, funny story. Tells you a lot about TR and what he thought about himself. Okay, so big legacies. Okay, the war in Cuba. So eventually, Spain does surrender after that splendid little war of just over 3 to 4 months. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of really important consequences from this. Okay, number one, let's talk about land. Puerto Rico. Okay, the Philippines, and then also land in Cuba for a naval base, which we'll later, as we know today, call it Guantanamo Bay. Okay, now these holdings here. Okay, obviously Puerto Rico's become a pretty significant place today with the recent hurricanes and things that have happened there. The Philippines, we'll talk about with World War II and the legacies with that, and then Guantanamo Bay is still owned by the U.S. It is quite controversial. Okay, but let's talk about why the U.S. and what this kind of causes for the future. The U.S. from this war will use this as an excuse to pretty much get involved in Cuba from this point whenever it wants to. Okay, and this is all the way up until the present day in 2018. Okay, when we've had until 2016 the blockade, or not really blockade, but we've had the embargo against Cuba set up. Essentially, we were just never traded with them. So there was something put into, I'll give you a good example of this, is how we've been justifying our involvement there, is immediately after the Cuban-American War, we put into something in place in the Cuban Constitution called the Platt Amendment. Okay? Now, this amendment was forced into the Cuban Constitution and basically says a whole bunch of things. Number one, Cuba cannot sign treaties with other nations. It can't go into debt, and any time that the U.S. felt that Cuban independence or its government was under threat, they could intervene. Okay? And we will see intervention in Cuba really time and time again, all the way up to Fidel Castro, and then pretty much afterwards all the way up until the present day, where really our relationship with Cuba is still pretty controversial in a lot of circles. Okay? Other than this, what are the larger legacies? So there's land, the justified intervention in Cuba into the future. It's going to launch Teddy Roosevelt to the vice presidency in 1900, and then once McKinley dies from being assassinated, to the presidency. Okay? And then also is going to be the start of what we call anti-imperialist movements in the U.S. Now these start off very, very small. Okay? And imperialism is simply the practice of building an empire. Okay? But we're going to start to see these small little anti-imperialist movements start to kind of slowly build, and you will see that these will really kind of rush into their kind of greatest moments of power here at the end of World War I. Okay, so other than that, that is our lesson for today. Hopefully this has been helpful. There is an exit ticket that I would like you to complete with this, so please make sure you do that. And until then, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.